Hey, welcome back to the channel, everyone. And in this week's video, we're going to take a look at Cisco IOS configuration files. Hi, my name is Kevin Wallace, and we're going to begin this video by distinguishing between RAM and NVRAM and the configuration files that live in each. We have running config that lives in RAM and startup config that lives in NVRAM. We'll discuss those. We'll check out some copy commands we can issue in Cisco IOS. And it might not be sufficient to only have our running config backed up to a local startup config in NVRAM. Instead, we might want to have a remote backup. After all, something could happen to the data center where the router is located. There could be a fire, and if that router is destroyed, then we just lost our configuration. So we'll take a look at some remote backup options, and then we're going to go out to a live interface and demonstrate a variety of configuration file commands. And if you're watching this video, I'm assuming that you work regularly with Cisco IOS, and if that's the case, I'd like to invite you to check out our Udemy site. Just go to kwtrain.com/Udemy, and you can check out these training courses that prepare you for a variety of Cisco certifications, in addition to CompTIA's Network Plus certification. And the great news is you could pick up one or more than one of these courses at the very, very low Udemy pricing. Now, if you're ready, I'm ready, so let's jump into our look at Cisco IOS configuration files. In this video, we want to consider how to work with configuration files on our Cisco routers and switches. First of all, consider a router, and maybe we have a laptop with some terminal emulation software on it, and we're plugging into the console port of the router. Let's say we go into privileged exec mode, and we start giving commands changing the configuration of our router. When we do that, those changes that we're applying, they get written to the RAM, the memory running in the router right now. This is called our running configuration, which has the name of running-config in Cisco IOS. And the commands we type in will be running on the router. However, if I were to turn off my router or switch right now and then power it back on, those new configurations that I just entered, they would be gone. They do not survive a reboot. They were just living in RAM. They were living in memory. So after we give these commands, if we want them to be available after a reboot, we need to copy the running configuration to what's called the startup configuration, which has the name of startup-config in Cisco IOS. This startup configuration lives in non-volatile RAM. In other words, it will survive a reboot. And the way we can copy our running configuration to our startup configuration is by saying copy space running-config space startup-config. However, remember in Cisco IOS, we don't always have to type out the full command. If we give enough characters to make that command or option unique, Cisco IOS knows what we mean. And if we want to copy our running config to our startup config, all we have to do is say copy run star. And that's going to copy our configuration over to non-volatile RAM. So on the device itself, if we want to back up our configuration so that it survives a reboot, remember we have two storage locations. We have RAM, that's where our running config lives, and we have NVRAM, where our startup config lives. But what if something really bad happened to the router? Maybe there was a natural disaster or a fire, and the router was destroyed. It's not going to do us much good if our configuration is stored on non-volatile RAM on a router that has been destroyed. So it's a good practice to make remote backups, maybe on other servers. And as a few examples of the type of servers we could back up our configuration to, we could back it up to an FTP server, an SCP or a secure copy server, or a TFTP server. And of those options, you might want to consider a secure copy because that's going to be a more secure transmission of your configuration. And to illustrate how we would copy to an external server, let's see how to back up our running config and our startup config to, let's say, a TFTP server. What we could do to copy our running config to the TFTP server is simply say copy run TFTP. And then we would be prompted for the IP address of the TFTP server. We would be prompted for the file name we wanted to use. And similarly, if we wanted to copy our startup config to the TFTP server, we could simply say copy star TFTP. Now let's go out to a live interface and demonstrate some of these commands in action. We're sitting on router R1, and I'm going to change the name to router 1. Let's go into global configuration mode, and I'll say the host name is router1 instead of just R1. The reason I made that change, and I'm going to back out of my configuration, the reason I made that change is I want to show you that there is a difference now between the running config and the startup config, because I have not saved the change that I just made to my startup configuration. So if I say show run, that's going to show me my running configuration, and we can see that it does reflect the change I just made. It says the host name is router 1. However, if I were to reboot the router right now, the host name would go back to R1. We can prove that by saying show star. That's going to show our startup configuration. Because I haven't copied my running config to my startup config, it still says the host name is R1. So let's take a look at how we could copy the running config to the startup config. I'll issue a Q to exit out of this, and I'll say copy, run, and I could stop right there, but I could use my tab autocomplete to see the full command, copy running-config space, and I'll type in star, and I could press enter right now, but just so we can see the full command, I'll hit a tab, and we see the full command is copy running-config startup-config. It confirms that we want to copy this to startup-config, and we do. We'll press enter, and now the startup configuration should believe that our hostname is router 1. Let's confirm that. Let's do a show star, and we see that it has been updated with the change we made because we copied the running config to the startup config. I'll do a Q to exit out of that, and let's say that we want to copy to an external server. And I'll use a TFTP server, that's a trivial file transfer protocol server that I have running here in the studio. Again, in the real world, you might want to consider SCP. That stands for Secure Copy Protocol, but I often say Secure Copy for short. But you might want to consider SCP because it's going to give you a more secure transfer. It's not going to be unencrypted like FTP or TFTP. But here in my isolated environment, I'll use TFTP, and I can say copy, run, TFTP, or I could have said copy star TFTP, and it asks the address, that's the IP address, or the name of the remote host. And I have a TFTP server running on Microsoft Windows, and that machine has an IP address of 172.16.100.16. We'll press enter, and it asks what the destination file name should be, and I'm fine with the default of router1-confg. I'll press enter, and we see from the 2 exclamation points that the copy was successful. We see how big the copy was, 2012 bytes. And let's go over to that Windows machine now and see if we can open up that file that we just copied. Here on Microsoft Windows, I'm running a free TFTP server that I downloaded from SolarWinds, and we see the file name. It's router1-confg. Let's open up that file in a text editor. And here we see our configuration file backed up to this TFTP server. Now let's see how we would restore a file from a TFTP server to our startup configuration. Let's go back to our router, and I'll say copy. This time, the source of my copy is going to be the TFTP server, so I'll say copy TFTP, and let's say the destination is startup-config. We'll press enter. It's the same host we used last time, so I'll press enter. That is the source file name. We'll press enter again. The destination file name is indeed startup-config. And we're told that our non-volatile storage was configured from this file on that TFTP server. Oh, by the way, when you're doing this, there's one extra command you might need to give. Let's go back into global configuration mode. If you have more than one router interface, and your TFTP server doesn't know how to reach all of those interfaces, you might need to specify which interface you're using for TFTP. So in my case, I said IP TFTP source-interface, and I'm using a source interface on this router of gig 0/0/0. That interface has an IP address that's on the same subnet as my TFTP server, so I know the TFTP server would know how to get back to the IP address of this interface. Not always required, but I wanted to make sure you were aware of that command. And that's a look at how we can work with our Cisco IOS configuration files.